Cool. So we're still probably waiting on a few people to join us, but I'll just get my intro out of the way before I hand over to Smina. So hi everyone, my name is Nelson Cummins. I'm the Communities and Campaigns Officer at the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, and thank you for joining us for this Black History Month talk this afternoon. So I was just going to say a little bit about the background to Black History Month in Scotland. So in 2001, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, back when we were known as the Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance, coordinated the first Black History Month programme in Scotland. And our approach to Black History Month is rooted in an approach very similar to the approach taken across the wider UK, whose foundations are in 1987 and work done by a multiracial group in the Greater London Council to form a Black History Month that offers a space in which we can celebrate the contributions of ethnic minority people to Scotland and the UK. And it also offers a space in which to recognise the historic racism Black people have been victims of and the racism that they still experience today. And Black History Month offers an opportunity for us to reflect on Scotland's hidden histories and further our understandings of histories that we are often not taught about. So Black history is Scotland's history, and it is crucial as ever that Black history is celebrated and taught in Scotland. And this only happens with a change in our history, our heritage sectors, and our education system. So Black history needs to be more integrated into the ways in which we teach and tell stories about Scotland. And finally, I'll say a little bit about this year's Black History Month programme. It was a real collaborative effort. We were really happy to work with a range of partners from across the community, voluntary and public sectors. There's lots of events in the programme that have been really good and exciting, and there's still a lot of exciting events to come. And you can find out more about what's happening in October on our Black History Month website. And if you put Black History Month Scotland into Google, it should hopefully be the first hit that comes up. But I'll introduce today's speaker. So we're really happy to be joined by Smina Akhtar. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow, and her research revolves around experiences of and resistance to state racism in Scotland. And today she's going to talk to us about education, race and class in Scottish history. There'll be a chance for questions and discussions during the session, but if you have anything that you want to ask, please use the chat or Q&A features you can find at the bottom of your screen and put any questions in there. You can put questions through during the talk or put them in after. Myself and my colleague Ahmed will be keeping an eye on them. So yeah, I'll now hand over to Smina, who's going to lead this talk this afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Nelson. And thanks to Nelson and to Cred for inviting me to do this talk today. I'm quite privileged to be asked. So today, my talk today is going to focus on racism in the education system, and in particular on the experiences of teachers within schools and the further education sector, which is part of what my PhD research is on. I'm also going to kind of concentrate on the historical dimensions of racism in education, because education is kind of one of those areas that people know a little bit about, particularly kind of modern day, what's happening in the modern day. So I thought I would concentrate on the historical and then bring it right up to the present when I interviewed teachers. And look at how they challenged racism and how they experienced it. And that was based on interviews that I did with a few teachers just before the pandemic started. One question you might want to ponder over is, when we talk about racism in Scotland, is it helpful to think about whether there's more or less racism in Scotland, or should we actually be thinking about whether racism exists? What does it look like and how it might be different in Scotland, and what we need to do to challenge it. So just looking at the history, producing citizens, producing people with the necessary skills and values to pursue kind of the state's economic and interests are a key driver in education policy today. And I don't think any government, whether it's Scottish or whether it's the British government, would deny that. And it's not a new use of education. system by the state. So the development of mass education in Scotland took place again, you know, it's not new, to meet the economic and social needs as well, but it also reflected the ideological values of an expanding industrial economy at that time, which was within the context of the British Empire. So where previously schools had been organised through churches, parish churches, with religious education being the main priority, the Education Scotland Act 1872 made education compulsory and brought schools into the control of local boards appointed by the state. Now, Catholic schools didn't join until later on, until 1919, which was some years, you know, about 40, 50 years later, actually. So it kind of gave the state the authority over what values were instilled in children from a very early age. So the idea of race was reproduced in the education system because it was developed, you know, because its development coincided with an era of scientific racism where African slavery and expansion of empire was justified by eugenics and social Darwinism at that time. So negative images of Black and Irish people predominantly were commonplace in magazines, both for the elites, but also in cartoons as well as books that were used in schools. So if you can change the slide, so next slide. So this image was featured in Harper's Weekly magazine, and it's one that people may have you might have seen before. It's really kind of quite a famous one, and it shows an Irishman resembling an African, and both presented as kind of ape-like. So the state's use and although this wasn't replicated within the education system, it was kind of replicated in the popular media at the time. So you can imagine the kind of things that were, you know, the kind of ideas that were actually present in the education system as well. So the state's use of the education system, you know, the state used the education system to serve its political agenda too, and it dates to that period, and it still does it now. So kind of you know, during a discussion on history books in Dunblane, Dunblane School Board, one minister said that our main object of historical teaching is to make enlightened and loyal citizens, not of Scotland or England of the past, but of the British Empire of today. So that just tells you the kind of thinking, you know, state thinking that was present at that time. Next slide. So mass education was used by the state to encourage a loyalty to empire, as I've said, as well as promoting loyalty to the Union as well. And the president, and that kind of, that also applied to the Teachers Union at the time, which was the EIS, the Education Institute of Scotland. So the president of the EIS at that time held similar views, though many members disagreed. So it wasn't, so they weren't shared amongst the whole of the EIS, but quite a large section of it, where, so people did disagree. When the transfer of education responsibility from the Scottish Education Department to the Secretary of State was taking place, he said, "We are one nation and one profession, whether we are Scotchmen, Englishmen, or Irishmen, and the sooner distinctions which entail disqualifications and disadvantages are forever effaced, the sooner will this grand British Empire become united in heart and soul, and yet more great, glorious, and true." So that was the president of the EIS talking. So you can imagine the types of ideas, both at government and at trade union level. So what were the implications of the education system itself. So the leadership of the main education, of the Scottish education trade unions, share the imperialist ideas of the British Empire, you know. So this enabled the state to produce and reproduce racist language and framing of Scotland's role in empire and promote loyalty to it. So those who governed education were loyal to the empire. What about those who taught in schools? Now, if we look at the teaching of history in schools from the mid 19th century, it shows that the various ways that this was done. So whilst the state doesn't prescribe a list of books that should be taught in schools, the formerly kind of church-controlled education system had already produced teachers with those ideas, with very conservative religious ideas, and when some of them became teachers in the state system, they were likely to teach what conformed to those beliefs themselves. Next slide. So Marika Sherwood does an analysis of history books, and she shows that what was taught contained images of Black Africans as inferior, only able to carry out manual labor, and in danger of extinction were it not for the intervention of the colonizers, thus conforming to eugenicist forms of thinking that dominated that era. University professors speaking and writing in the early, even in the early 20th century, included Professor Gregory of the University of Glasgow, where I am, who argued that interracial marriage would produce a weaker species because the Negro, the professor proclaimed, was gifted in art and music, but lacked individual ambition, and therefore took pleasure in patient, heavy toil. But he has never produced an artist, a painter, or poet of first rate, or developed a great ruler or political thinker. So that was a university professor at the University of Glasgow. So these beliefs undoubtedly influenced what was taught to teachers in schools. You know, the League of Coloured Peoples, and this was in England, found that the colonies were defined and understood only from the time of their colonization. So they had, you know, as far as the colonizers were concerned, they had no history, suggesting they had no prior history or existence, and Africa was understood only in terms of what its value was to the British Empire. So further studies in the 1960s showed that little had changed, and writing in 1974, Anne Beer argued that certain forms of bias, for instance, racism, exists in school histories and ought to be removed. And racialized representations of the other were not limited to the Black person. They also apply to the Irish at the time, because remember, Ireland was Britain's first colony. You know, anti-Irish racism is not the same, and it's, you know, nowhere near as strong as anti-Black and Islamophobia, but you know, at that time it was quite profound. So her examination of how the Irish famine of 1845 was depicted in history books taught in secondary schools found books used in the 1920s contained racialized images of the Irish. A book published in 1925 and used in Scottish schools stated the Irishman is ignorant and improvident and with a careless, attractive gaiety of his own, and has little of the Scotchman's instinct for business. So not only did the book depict the Irish in a racist way, it kind of it pitted Scottish and Irish against each other, and with the potential to produce conflict and beliefs that the Scottish were actually better than the Irish. And the same text said, unfortunately too, the Irishman who found a new home in America carried with them their grudge against England. they have always been ready to stir up trouble against England and America, and to foster disputes in Ireland itself. So you can imagine, if that was taught in schools, what influence would it have on the ideas of young people? So these books portray the colonized Irish people as violent troublemakers and define them as inferior, an enemy of the British, so producing a self-image at the same time of the British citizen as superior. So these negative and stereotypical kind of portrayals of the colonized would undoubtedly impact the views held by school children. Reports by the Mass Observation Archives in Schools from 1937 found a collection of essays written by school children on cannibalism, and found most essays described natives as half-naked, cruel and treacherous in various parts of the world, and in various parts of the world as cannibals. A collection of essays written by 12-year-olds used the N-word to describe Black people. And these books were obviously, taught in schools in Scotland as well as in England. So those ideas would have been present in Scottish kids as well. And another one was, they are usually very strong and can stand a lot of beatings. Some are supposed to possess magic. Ends are used as slaves abroad in countries where it's too hot for white men to work. Some are very civilized and even work as servants. So really, really backward ideas about Black people, former slaves, current slaves, and that as well. So it's quite clear from the analysis of a small number of history books used in schools from the late 19th century that an explicit racialized framing and language of the other was reproduced within the state education system, both in England and in Scotland, so demonstrating the role that the education plays in reproducing state racism. So moving on to England, if you can change the slide, I'm going to move on to look at England from the 1960s. So kind of quite a big jump for two reasons. First, not that much research has been done on racism in Scotland, particularly academic research. And second, because Scotland was a full member of the Union. And although English, with education, Scotland always had a separate education system, but there was a limit. Books produced for the education system, that were quite similar, and used in England and in Scotland. So many argue that the type of racism that happened in the 1960s in England didn't actually happen in Scotland, because there were not the same numbers of Black and Asian population in Scotland. But remember that racism was embedded in the education system from an early age, from an early time, from the time of where mass education was rolled out, 1872 Act, and obviously before that as well. So it may have impacted smaller numbers, but it did exist, and it did actually impact lives. So I'm not sure if anybody watched Steve McQueen's Small Axe films, and one was on the education system and about how Black children were defined as educationally subnormal. And I found it quite, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, but people started looking for more information about education, schools for the educationally subnormal, as a result of this film, because a lot of people just didn't know that it happened. So writing in 1971, Bernard Cord brought attention to the disproportionately high number of immigrants, particularly of West Indian origin, who had been placed in schools for the educationally subnormal. So I've got a few figures here. Now, he proposes that processes used to assess the educational ability of children were biased. on cultural and class grounds. And teachers' expectations were based on their own past experience of assessing white kids. So that was their normal. And a report produced by the Inner London Education Authority, ILEA, in 1968 stated that 23% of children in ESN schools, which is schools for the educationally subnormal, were West Indian, even though West Indians comprised half of immigrant children in ordinary schools. So one authority had 60% immigrant children in their school, in ESN schools. And while confirming that over 70% of them could have been wrongly placed, the ILEA report said that they would remain there until alternatives could be found. So the obvious solution would have been to move those children to state schools in their area, but that wasn't done. So ILEA knew that children were wrongfully placed, but did nothing to resolve the matter. And I don't know if they saw that as racism. They probably didn't at that time. And I think it's useful to look at the political context of the period in which that happened. Remember, post-war immigration policies had already problematized the presence of Black and brown migrants. Black youth had been racially criminalized within state and police discourses, and Black families had been labeled as dysfunctional. This was the era of, mugging, that term that was used for Black crime. As only Black crime, but when research was done, we found that it was actually committed equally by Black and white youths, but the police defined it as a Black crime. So the state's racialization of these communities at a wider level was already there. So it wasn't surprising that it was happening in education as well. In the 1960s and 1970s. Right, just moving on, just looking at how Black communities resisted. Now, Bernard Coates' 1971 book was actually written for the Caribbean Education and Community Association. So the report itself was part of a resistance movement. And was, it was part of a challenge by Black communities to the treatment of their children in schools. The Black supplementary school system movement was part of a movement to resist racism in education, and set out to fill gaps that state education fails to provide by teaching about Black history, as well as a wide range of skills, including typing, sewing, creative writing, as well as art and sculpture. But I think I would argue that, this resistance to racism was actually contained by the education system itself, because it brought in what is called multicultural education. Now, multicultural education defined kids, the racialized experiences of Black and Asian children in cultural terms, and prescribed culturally based solutions rather than look at the structures and histories that produce and continually reproduce racism. So the multicultural policies were never capable of addressing racism because of the way that they defined racism. As a misunderstanding resulting from lack of knowledge, rather than the actual structures and history. If we move to the next slide. Right, I'm not going to talk too much about Prevent. Prevent policy has been very different in Scotland and England. I remember speaking to a police officer not that long, probably about 4 years ago, and about the prevent policy. And he was a senior police officer I mean, he happened to be based in Lanarkshire, but he was saying, well, prevent in Scotland is not targeting the Muslim community, it's actually targeting the Irish community. And it's specifically in relation to fundraising for Ireland for the Republican cause. So it has been very different, and it's kind of reflected also in the figures. And prevent's kind of come back up again, obviously, with the killing of that MP just a few days ago, because he was stabbed to death by a Muslim. I'm sure that prevent in England is going to be ramped up, and the focus kind of recently has been far right, but I think it will, you know, I guess I'm thinking that it's going to start targeting Muslims again. So the war on terror, which brought about the prevent policy and also expand, brought it into the education system, has resulted in really high numbers of referrals from schools, but in England, but in Scotland, there've been very few referrals. According to Police Scotland, in the year ending 2020, only 100 people were referred to prevent. Of those, 49 were referred for de-radicalisation, while the remaining cases were considered not serious enough to be pursued. And most referred were far right. So I'm going to leave it at that and move on to, okay, so we've talked about the history in Scotland, and we've talked about England in the 1960s and 1970s. So I want to come back to Scotland, just how different is Scotland? And I want to talk about that in relation to teachers. Now, Rowena Arshad was a professor actually at Edinburgh University, and I think she's just retired. She found little difference in the experiences that pupils and teachers from racialised groups had of racism in Scotland. Writing in 2004, when she interviewed teachers, she found that many teachers' understanding of race equality was kind of limited to dealings with minority ethnic pupils and limited to addressing their language support needs. So it wasn't really about racism. But she also found that there was an underrepresentation of teachers from racialised backgrounds in Scottish schools. So in 2004, but in reporting in 2018, they found that little had changed. Teachers from racialised groups made up just 1% of the teaching profession in 2017. And one major barrier that they identified was the distinct lack of willingness to recognise racism or racial equality as a life feature in Scottish society and within the education system. Now, 3 years on, they reported again in 2021, so just earlier this year, and they found that the number of teachers from minority ethnic backgrounds had increased from 1.4% to 1.9%, and in the FE sector, EIS figures that I've got from the EIS say that racialised groups make up to 2.3% of the teaching staff in Scotland. And when you look at, what the BME population of Scotland is, I mean, the census says it's 10%. It's much, much higher. So the underrepresentation is huge, absolutely huge. And in Glasgow too, is much, much, much bigger. So I want to move on to talking about a little bit, just very quickly, about experiences that teachers that I interviewed had of racism. And I'm just going to pick 3 experiences. Now, I've changed people's names, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I really don't want them being identified. So Aziz told me of a racist incident at school while he was teaching. He said there was a member of staff who put on a racist accent of a Romanian kid, mimicking, taking the piss out of him and saying something really offensive also in the staff room. And no one said anything. In fact, nobody felt uncomfortable. Now, Aziz found support and solidarity from fellow teachers at a trade union event that he attended. Now, he didn't actually go to the union itself for support because the perpetrator was actually an EIS rep in the school. But getting support from, I think it was an event that was about racism that had been organised by the EIS. It gave him the confidence to speak to his head teacher. But when he told his head teacher, the head teacher basically said, well, if you want to file a report, then you can. And that was it. So the serious nature of racism wasn't acknowledged, and the onus was put on the teacher, which meant that that particular incident was never escalated to a local authority level. So it was never reported as is required by Glasgow City Council. Another FE lecturer who I'm going to call Sheila, had lots and lots of years of experience of teaching English at an FE level, but was doing admin work for years and years at a school. When she finally got a job as a lecturer, she told me that out of everyone that they had employed, she was the only one whose contract wasn't going to be renewed. And she'd been actually teaching the longest. But the idea of race in all those, in both incidents, was never invoked. The senior staff at the FE college, Sheila told me, was, well, when they tried to justify not renewing her contract, she said they always use skills. They would always say you don't have the skills that other people have. I asked them what skills do they have that I don't have, but they couldn't give me an answer. And we know, I mean, I've worked in the voluntary sector for many, many years, but in any kind of, whether it's voluntary or public sector, when an employer identifies a lack of skills in an employee, what happens is they're given relevant training. She was never offered that. Another incident was Ahmed's experience of racism. He had taken time off in lieu. He had accrued time off during the summer and had suggested that he wanted to take time off at Christmas, which many white lecturers did to visit family. The head of school said, yeah, it looks fine. He organised cover. The head of school said, we don't really need permission from the principal, but I'll write to him requesting permission. Nothing was heard from the head of school, but when he came back from holiday, he basically got a letter to say that you went on holiday without permission and you're going to get a final written warning. That was a long and protracted case. Ahmed did resist that and other incidences of racism in the college, and he actually produced a dossier of racism that he took to the board, and there's now a new principal. So all the teachers I experienced challenged the racism that they had experienced. Both the FE teachers are actually trade union reps now. So whereas before they were not really well supported by the trade union, they now support others who need help from the trade union. Just moving on to the next and last slide. This will be the last one. And I think we can conclude that often when it comes to racism in education, that the idea of race, and it follows racism, was embedded within the Scottish education system from the time and before that, actually, that saw the expansion of the state education system. Racism within the education system has never really been effectively addressed. It's no longer acceptable for certain language to be used, obviously. Racism doesn't stay the same, it changes. So the form that racism is present in today's Scottish education system. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that the idea of race may not be present and the language of racism may not be present. But we've got to that point in history where it's become so embedded and so entrenched and so institutionalized that often the practice of racism can take place without the idea of race ever being invoked. You know, it doesn't require an explicit ideological kind of presence anymore. You know, it takes the form of underrepresentation of teachers from racialized groups, their lack of representation in promoted posts, and their experiences of racism. I haven't been able to discuss school children's experience of racism, but you know, great work has been done by other organisations like Intercultural Youth in Scotland that are based in Edinburgh, by trade unions, and the subject of trade unions is not a simple one. Everyone I interviewed did not have good experiences of trade unions when they asked for support. And perhaps that's something that someone may want to raise in a discussion. But racism is challenged by teachers, both individually and collectively. Anti-Racist Educator is a collective of teachers. It's also challenged by pupils and those who support them. And aside from Intercultural Youth. And I know CRE has done quite a lot of work on racism in education as well. So I'm going to leave it at that